She was offered a chair and refused to sit in it. Instead, she ordered one of her own servants to kneel down on all fours and use them as her throne. That single moment, in a room full of Portuguese colonial officials, told the entire empire something it was completely unprepared to hear. This woman would never bow. Not to them, not to anyone. And what happened next? Over the following 40 years, is one of the most extraordinary true stories in all of recorded human history. A story of war, survival, strategy, and a resistance so powerful that even the empire that tried to destroy her ended up standing at her funeral. If you have never heard the name Queen Nzinga before today, that is not an accident. This is the story they left out of the textbooks. The story that got buried under centuries of colonial record-keeping designed to make African resistance look impossible. But it was not impossible. It happened. Every word of what you are about to hear is documented history. So stay right here, because this woman's life is about to change the way you think about power, courage, and what one person is actually capable of. To understand Queen Nzinga, you have to understand the world she was born into. The western coast of Central Africa in the late 16th century was not at peace. The Portuguese had been there for over 100 years by that point, and what had started as coastal trade agreements had transformed into something far more destructive. Slave ships lined the Atlantic shore from the Congo River south through present-day Angola. Portuguese allied raiders moved deeper inland every year, attacking villages, capturing men and women and children, and loading them onto ships headed across an ocean that none of them would ever return from. Entire communities were being erased. Kingdoms that had stood for generations were collapsing under the weight of constant raids and the political pressure that came with Portuguese military presence on the coast. The kingdom of Ndongo, sitting in the interior of what is today Angola, was watching this happen to its neighbors. And it knew its turn was coming. It was into this world, this burning, bleeding world, that Nzinga was born around the year 1583. Her father was King Ngola Kiluanji, the ruler of Ndongo. Her birth, according to traditional accounts passed down through generations, was marked immediately as unusual. She came into the world with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck, and the traditional healers who attended the birth said that was a sign that this child would be proud, powerful, and would never submit to anyone. Her father took that seriously, more seriously than most kings of that era would have. In a time when royal daughters were groomed primarily for marriage alliances with neighboring kingdoms, Ngola Kiluanji did something remarkable. He educated Nzinga the way he would have educated a son. He brought her into political discussions. He taught her the art of diplomacy and the language of negotiation. He exposed her to military strategy and hunting and combat. He trained her sharp mind like a weapon because he understood, perhaps better than he even realized, that sharp minds were going to matter more than anything else in the years ahead. The Portuguese kept pushing. Every year the raids went deeper inland. Every year the demands for tribute grew louder. When Nzinga's father died, her brother Ngola Mbande took the throne, and the contrast between the two of them could not have been more stark. Where Nzinga was disciplined, strategic, and calm under pressure, Mbande was paranoid, unstable, and cruel. His first acts as king included the murder of rival claimants to the throne, and then he turned to his own family. To eliminate any possibility that Nzinga could one day threaten his rule through a royal heir, Mbande had her son killed. He also ensured she could never have another child. He wanted her politically neutralized, domestically confined, finished as a threat before she had ever formally become one. He made one decision that would come back to define everything. He let her live. By 1622, Mbande's kingdom was unraveling. The Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, was applying maximum pressure, demanding tribute, threatening direct military intervention, and making it abundantly clear that Ndongo's days as an independent kingdom were numbered unless someone came to Luanda and negotiated a settlement. Mbande was too frightened to go himself, so he sent Nzinga as his official ambassador. Whether he expected her to fail or whether he simply had no one else capable of handling it, the result was the same. He sent her into the most important diplomatic meeting of the kingdom's survival, and she walked in with nothing but her mind and her nerve. The Portuguese had prepared the meeting room with deliberate care. The governor sat in a large, ornate chair. His advisors and officials sat in chairs around him. For Nzinga, the staff had placed a simple woven floor mat in the center of the room. It was not an oversight. It was a statement, calculated and intentional. You are a subordinate. You represent a lesser people. You will sit on the ground to confirm it, and this negotiation will begin from that position of inferiority. It was the kind of psychological opening move that colonial administrators used constantly to establish dominance before a single word of substance had been spoken. Nzinga looked at the mat. She looked at the governor sitting in his chair. Then she turned to one of her attendants and gave a quiet, calm signal. The attendant moved to the center of the room, dropped to their hands and knees on the floor, and held still. Nzinga walked forward, sat on her attendant's back, composed herself, and looked directly at the governor from exactly his eye level. She did not smile. She did not explain herself. She simply began to speak. The room went completely still. Nobody had a script for this. What followed was one of the most skillful diplomatic performances of the 17th century. Over the course of that meeting, Nzinga secured a peace agreement that protected Ndongo's territorial boundaries, arranged for the release of political prisoners being held by the Portuguese, and established terms that treated her kingdom as a sovereign entity rather than a tributary subject. She also accepted Christian baptism, taking the Portuguese name Ana de Sousa not out of personal religious conviction but as a precise political calculation. A baptized Christian ruler could not as easily be treated as a savage enemy. The Portuguese would have to engage with her through the framework of Christian diplomacy, which gave her protections that raw military resistance alone could not guarantee. She understood the rules of their game better than most of the people playing it. The Portuguese signed the treaty, and then, as they had done before, and would do again, they ignored every clause of it. Raids continued. Slave caravans kept moving through Ndongo territory. The agreement existed on paper and nowhere else. Nzinga returned home and told her brother the truth plainly. They will not honor agreements. They respond only to force. And she began, quietly and methodically, to prepare for what was coming. Mbandi died in 1624. The historical record is genuinely uncertain about whether it was suicide or something else. What is certain is that Nzinga stepped forward into the vacancy he left behind. She declared herself Ngola, the title meaning king, not queen. Traditional law in Ndongo held that a woman could not hold that office. Nzinga did not petition for an exception. She did not argue the law's legitimacy. She simply acted as though the obstacle did not exist, and she dared anyone to stop her. She adopted male warrior dress and presented herself in public as a warrior ruler rather than a ceremonial figurehead. She restructured her royal court in ways that stripped away every traditional mechanism that might have been used to marginalize her authority. She built her power from the ground up, on her own terms, in a shape that had no precedent and therefore no ready-made method of opposition. The Portuguese refused to recognize her. They selected a local man named Hari Akilawanji, backed him with Portuguese military support, and installed him as a rival claimant to the Ndongo throne. The kingdom was being destabilized from the inside while being pressured from the outside simultaneously. It was a colonial strategy that had worked on every other kingdom in the region. Nzinga recognized it for what it was and refused to be trapped by it. She made the decision that defined the middle act of her reign. She moved. She gathered her people, evacuated the contested territory, and marched eastward into the deep interior jungle. In 1631, she led a military campaign that conquered the neighboring kingdom of Matamba. She now had a new base, dense forest, natural defensive terrain, distance from the Portuguese coastal operations, and the freedom to build what she actually needed, which was not a court. It was a war machine. Building that war machine required allies, and Nzinga found them in a place that surprised everyone watching. The Mbangala were a nomadic warrior society operating across Central Africa with a reputation so fearsome that most kingdoms simply avoided any contact with them. Their fighting capability was extraordinary, and their initiation rituals were severe. Even the Portuguese, who were not easily impressed by African military forces, regularly hired Mbangala fighters as mercenaries because confronting them directly was simply too costly. Every political leader in the region knew who the Mbangala were. None of them had ever done what Nzinga did. She did not negotiate a contract with them. She did not offer payment or territorial concessions. She joined them. She went through their rituals. She adopted their warrior identity and their customs and earned a place among them not as a patron, but as a member. In doing so, she fused her own political intelligence and diplomatic experience with their unmatched military capability in the field. The result was a fighting force that the Portuguese had no established counter-strategy for because nothing like it had existed before. Simultaneously, Nzinga was operating on a global strategic level that most of her contemporaries never attempted. The Dutch Republic was locked in a prolonged military and commercial conflict with Portugal that stretched across the Atlantic world, covering Brazil, the Caribbean, and major trade routes on multiple oceans. Nzinga made direct contact with Dutch representatives and proposed a formal alliance, military coordination against the Portuguese in Angola in exchange for trade partnership and Dutch naval support on the coast. The Dutch accepted. In 1641, Dutch forces launched a naval assault that captured Luanda, the main Portuguese port on the Angolan coast, in direct military coordination with Nzinga's land forces. For one extraordinary documented moment in history, a coalition led by a black African queen had driven the Portuguese entirely out of their most strategically valuable African territory. It had never been done before. The colonial playbook had no page for it. The Portuguese came back. In 1648, a massive Portuguese fleet retook Luanda. The Dutch, stretched thin by conflicts on multiple continents, withdrew their support from the alliance and left. Nzinga was pushed back inland again. She was in her mid-60s by this point. She had been fighting in one form or another since before most European governors assigned to Angola had been born. Her sister Mukumbu had been captured by Portuguese forces and was being held as a hostage. The loss was real, and the grief was real, and she kept fighting. She retreated into the Matamba interior and built something that military historians today describe as a remarkably sophisticated guerrilla warfare operation. She used the terrain of the Central African jungle as an active weapon, cutting Portuguese supply lines, launching ambushes from positions that were invisible until the moment of attack, then dissolving back into the forest before any counter-response could land. She established a connected network of villages and intelligence runners who tracked Portuguese troop movements across wide distances and fed that information back to her command. She ran dedicated operations to intercept Portuguese slave caravans moving through the interior, freeing the captives, who then joined her forces, adding fighters who had the most personal and powerful motivation imaginable to keep fighting. Her kingdom became self-sufficient, specifically so that economic pressure from the coast could not be used to starve her resistance into submission. The Portuguese tried every available approach and ran into the same wall every time. Direct military assault failed repeatedly. They could never pin her forces down long enough to force a decisive engagement. Negotiated settlement collapsed whenever the Portuguese tried to include terms that compromised her sovereignty. Assassination attempts produced nothing. One Portuguese governor after another wrote back to Lisbon explaining why the pacification campaign was costing more than projected and taking longer than anticipated. The honest version of those reports would have read simply, "There is one woman in the jungle who will not stop, and we do not know how to make her stop." A Portuguese missionary named Antonio de Gaeta, who spent years in the region during this period and left detailed written records, documented personally witnessing Nzinga on the battlefield in her late 60s, dressed in full warrior armor, commanding her forces directly during active military operations. She was not directing the war from a throne room at a safe distance. She was present in the field. She carried every year of that war in her body, and she kept going. By the mid-1650s, Portugal had arrived at a conclusion 3 decades of war had forced upon them. Nzinga was not going to be defeated. The cost of sustaining the campaign against Matamba was too high. The results were always the same, and the resources being consumed could not be justified against an enemy that simply refused to break. In 1657, Portugal signed a formal peace treaty with Queen Nzinga. The terms recognized her as the legitimate sovereign ruler of Matamba and Ndongo. Portuguese-backed proxy forces were to be withdrawn. Her sister Mukumbu was released and returned to her. It was, by any reasonable reading of the document, a Portuguese concession to a woman they had spent more than 30 years trying to eliminate. She was in her mid-70s when she signed it. In the years that followed, Nzinga rebuilt. She re-established trade networks. She allowed missionaries to operate within her kingdom, maintaining the diplomatic visibility that came with that relationship while keeping absolute political authority in her own hands. She reconstructed the institutions of her kingdom with the same disciplined intelligence she had applied to every challenge before it. Queen Nzinga died in December 1663. She was approximately 80 years old. She died in her own kingdom, in her own bed, as a free and sovereign ruler, not captured, not exiled, not broken, exactly what she had always insisted on being. The Portuguese sent official representatives to her funeral. Today in Luanda, the same city where a colonial governor once placed a floor mat at her feet to remind her of her place, there is a large bronze statue of Queen Nzinga. She is seated on a throne, looking out toward the Atlantic Ocean. Contemporary military historians who study pre-modern guerrilla warfare rank her campaigns among the most tactically sophisticated of the entire era, placing her strategic methods alongside doctrine that Western military theory would not formally develop until centuries later. Angola recognizes her as a founding national hero. The historical record, when you read it without the filter of colonial interpretation, tells the story of one of the most capable military and political leaders the world has ever produced. She did not end the slave trade. She did not stop colonialism from spreading across the continent. The weight of that was too great for any single person to carry, and pretending otherwise would dishonor the truth of how enormous that fight truly was. But what she proved, with her life, her wars, her treaties, and her refusal to ever accept the terms that were imposed on her, is that resistance was possible. That one African kingdom, led by one woman with the right combination of intelligence, endurance, and absolute refusal to be broken, could make the most powerful colonial empire in the world come to the table, on her terms, with her name on the treaty as an equal. The next time someone tells you that one person cannot change the course of history, remember the woman who turned a servant into a throne and looked an empire in the eye. Remember someone who fought a 40-year war and made her enemy blink first. Remember the queen they spent centuries trying to erase and failed completely. If this story moved you, share it right now. Because history like this belongs to everyone, and the only reason it stays hidden is because not enough people are telling it. Drop in the comments below. Did you know about Queen Nzinga before today, or is this the first time you have heard her name? And if you want more real documented untold history that the textbooks deliberately left out, the next video is right here waiting for you. Do not let stories like this one disappear.